Greetings, friends. My name is Pavlo Stelmach, and now we'll unveil the top news of recent days. Today, Ukraine celebrates Volunteer Day. I will try to explain a little. There is a word volunteer in the English language. This is a person who voluntarily offers himself or herself for a service or undertaking, or a person who performs a service willingly and without pay. And also a person who enters the service voluntarily rather than through conscription or draft, especially or special or temporary service rather than a member of the regular permanent army. It is precisely the people described by the last definition that we celebrate today. Do you know why today? Because on March 14, 2014, the first volunteers went to training center for fight in Donbass. Straight from the Maidan revolution, a month before they fought for their own beliefs with the pro-Russian authorities in the center of Kiev, and in March they went to the front to defend the country from a Russian attack.
Exactly 10 years ago, on March 14th, in the morning, directly from Maidan Незалежності, hundreds of Maidan self-defense fighters left for training in Нові Петрівці. They became fighters of the 1st Volunteer Battalion of the National Guard of Ukraine. In a few days, volunteer battalions were already organized in many cities of Ukraine. Former teachers, doctors, students, businessmen, athletes, IT workers made their choice to defend the independence of Ukraine. I remember the faces of the soldiers during the anti-terrorist operation in the east of Ukraine. I remember this courage and crazy motivation. These are the fighters that every commander, every military leader dreams of worldwide. Alexander Syrskyi, Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, on Facebook.
10 years ago, at this time, the Russians were completing the annexation of Crimea. In a week, the State Duma will make a decision on the annexation of Crimea. And in order to quickly forget about the peninsula, they started a war in Ukrainian Donbass. And if you listen to Putin's statements, at that time you will hear that there are also military personnel in Crimea without identification marks. It is not known where they came from. And in Donbass, miners and tractor drivers came out to oppose the Kiev authorities. But in a few years, the Kremlin will already be handing out medals for the liberation of Crimea, and in Donbass they will recognize that Russian personnel fought against Ukrainians, not local people. Therefore, look closely at the people who are rallying in your country. Very often it may not be your neighbors, but Russians in disguise. After all, a few years ago, hundreds of Russian agents went abroad together with people fleeing from mobilization. But it was not only in 2014 that volunteers went to the front line. In February 2022, thousands of Ukrainians throughout the territory went to the military commissariats, the Teroborona. They left their usual lives and have been protecting the country and civilians from Russian invasion for over 2 years now. These people did not want to be in the military. They were forced by life and a mad neighbor next door. They learned war not in academies but in trenches and dugouts. Many of them will not return to their civilian jobs because they will decide to go to military service. And some have already laid down their lives defending the country. And there are a lot of such brave people, because each of our defenders is a descendant of Cossacks who were not afraid of death, not afraid of the enemy. They simply went to fight for themselves, for their land and their relatives. They did in hundreds of years ago. They do it even today, risking health and life. And I hope that today you too will remember the people who are currently in the army instead of warm home. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine calls on Ukrainians living in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine or forcibly staying in the territory of Russia not to participate in the pseudo-elections of the President of Russian Federation, and foreign states and international organizations not to send international observers, and refrain from recognizing the election results. The Ukrainian Foreign Ministry also urged to avoid places of mass gathering of people near the so-called polling stations, as well as military facilities of the occupying forces for their own safety and in view of the Russian authorities' propensity for provocations. Forced participations in the so-called elections of millions of citizens of Ukraine who live in the temporarily occupied territories or who were forcibly relocated to the territory of the Russian Federation. It is also illegal. However, it is difficult to call this farce a democratic election. After all, there was no election campaign in Russia, according to generally recognized democratic principles. Opponents of the Russian government were eliminated or killed. Therefore, these elections are neither objective nor legitimate. We call on states and international organizations not to direct international observers to participate in another farce which the Kremlin passes off as presidential elections, organized by it, in particular on the sovereign territory of Ukraine, to refrain from recognizing their results.
Despite the repeated condemnation by the international community of the Russian Federation's holding of illegally null and void events in the temporary occupied territories of Ukraine under the guise of pseudo-referendums and elections, the Russian leadership deliberately ignores calls for an end to such action, and contrary to numerous UN General Assembly resolutions and decision number of other authoritative international organizations in support of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, continues to attempt to annex the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by the Russian Federation as a result of armed aggression by extending Russian legislation to them. Statement of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine.
The Ministry of Foreign Affairs emphasizes that the Russian dictatorship has long had nothing to do with democracy, in particular the procedure of open and competitive elections, and that Vladimir Putin, who is wanted by the International Criminal Court, has been kept in power for 24 years not by the free will of the people, but by manipulation of the constitution of the Russian Federation. Total propaganda, destruction of any manifestation of political competition and political violence, including assassinations of prominent independent political figures. NATO members should quickly provide additional military aid to Ukraine to avoid a serious historical mistake associated with Russia's victory on the battlefield. This was stated by NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg during the annual report. He emphasized that Ukrainians have enough courage. They lack ammunition.
The fact that the Russians are able to outgun the Ukrainians every day, of course, is a huge challenge. Is one of the reasons why the Russians have been able to make some advances on the battlefield over the last weeks and months, and therefore it is an urgent need for allies to make the decisions necessary to step up, provide more ammunition to Ukraine. Of course, we have the capacity, we have the economies to be able to provide Ukraine what they need. This is a question of political will. To take the decisions and to prioritize support for Ukraine.
Stoltenberg stressed that NATO countries must dig deep and fast, and delay will lead to real consequences on the battlefield. This is a critical moment. It will be a serious historical mistake to allow Russian dictator Vladimir Putin to take over, he said. Earlier, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg stated that this year a record 18 out of 31 NATO members will meet the alliance's defense spending goal of 2% of GDP. Also, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen has also said that Europe must limit social welfare spending and cut taxes to deter a more aggressive Russia through a sustained increase in defense and security funding. And the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, said that the European Union should do more for defense to replenish and modernize their weapons. And Polish President Andrzej Duda said that the other day the NATO member states should increase defense spending to 3% of their GDP. Well, Europe is preparing for a big war, and it is the Ukrainians who give them the time to prepare, with their lives and health. Don't forget about it. That concludes our today's video. Thank you for watching. Stay updated, comment, like and subscribe to our UATV English channel for more news from Ukraine. Your support is what really matters. Goodbye.